Good afternoon, and thank you so much for attending Cherry Bekaert's webinar entitled SOC 2 Changes and What This Means to You. For those of you on the East Coast, we appreciate you spending your lunch hour with us. So nice to see so many of our great SOC clients present, and welcome to all others attending. We have a brief agenda of what we intend to cover on this slide, but a few items to note before we get started. We know everyone is extremely busy, especially this time of year, so we're hoping to keep this webinar to 30 minutes or less. However, we're happy to answer any questions you have along the way. Feel free to input those using the text box on your screen, and we will get to as many as we can. For any of you that we don't have time for today, rest assured we will follow up with you directly. Anyone wanting a copy of these slides, feel free to contact us using the information on the last slide. Now let's get started. My name is Neil Bagan. I'm a principal with Cherry Bekaert's Risk Advisory Service Group. I've been with the firm over 10 years and have helped lead the SOC practice since joining. With me today is John Richardson, a director in our group. John, too, has been with the firm for over 10 years, and many of you know John as he signs a number of SOC audits around the firm. He is also a peer reviewer for SOC audits performed by other accounting firms, and more recently participated in the AICPA's SOC 2 working group, which developed the Practitioner's Guide. The two of us work alongside Steve Ursillo, who is the firm's leader in cybersecurity and information assurance. Steve was unable to join today because, shocker, he's out leading one of his numerous SOC engagements. Rest assured, more webinars featuring Steve are coming soon, and we've included contact information for all three of us on the last slide. So, before we get into the changes that are affecting SOC 2s that are coming right around the corner, we wanted to just provide a brief history on SOC 2 audits themselves. So if we think back to the early 90s, SAS 70s, which many of you may remember, and Web Trust and SysTrust. So SAS 70s really were for service providers that process transactions relevant to financial reporting, and that is the key here. They were relevant to financial reporting, and really they were intended for other CPAs, so the auditors of your clients, if you will. Whereas Web Trust and SysTrust developed around the same time, established trust service principles focused on IT security. And this was really related to the boom in e-commerce and online consumer interaction. Moving forward to about 2011, the AICPA decided to divide the two into SOC 1 and SOC 2, mainly because SAS 70s were really being used incorrectly at this time. They had come to light really as a huge boom as a result of Sarbanes-Oxley. And really, a lot of service providers were ultimately undergoing SAS 70s that were not impacting the financial reporting of their clients. So they just were not being used properly. So the AICPA decided to recodify into what was known as SOC 1 and SOC 2. So generally, SOC 1 replaced SAS 70. So again, for those service providers impacting financial reporting. Whereas SOC 2 really helped replace Web Trust and SysTrust, and they were introduced for more of the technology service providers. And they incorporated the AICPA's trust principles from Web Trust and SysTrust. Fast forward a few years later, effective in May 2017, there was another recodification. As many of you are aware, the AICPA loves to recodify. This really affected all attestation audits and came under the umbrella SSAE 18. This included information security engagements such as SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 2 Plus, SOC 3, SOC for Cyber, and what will soon be known to the general public, SOC for Vendor Supply Chain.
Hey, Neil, this is John. I'm sorry to interrupt, but we got a question. And the question that we have is, can you give a little explanation on the difference between SOC 2 and SOC for Cyber? Absolutely. And great question. We get it all the time. Kind of the easy answer, and we can provide more details, and we will in future webinars, is that today a SOC report is typically intended to provide report users with information about a service organization's system. Relevant to the trust service principles, one or more, which those we'll talk about are security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, or privacy. And that's really to enable users to assess and address the risks that arise from using a service organization's system or service. Whereas SOC for Cyber, on the other hand, it provides users with information about a service organization's overall risk management program. And as mentioned previously, I mentioned Steve Ursillo. He and I will be leading a webinar on this very topic in Q1 2019, so be on the lookout for that.
Another question, I don't see it popping up just yet, but oftentimes people are confused about SOC 2 or SOC 2 Plus. So SOC 2 Plus is where another framework, and some of those may be NIST, PCI, ISO, for example, high trust would be another, can be incorporated into the body of a SOC 2 audit and ultimately a SOC 2 report. There are a few different ways to do this, so feel free to reach out if you have questions on this as well. And then the last one that I mentioned kind of on this third column here is SOC for vendor supply chain. That's expected to hit the market sometime in 2019, and we'll certainly hold a webinar on those audits as they get closer as well. I hope that answered your question. Leading to this last column, really, this is effective for reports ending after December 15th, 2018. What it is the 2017 trust service criteria for security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy must be used. Again, these are for any reports ending after December 15th, so effective December 16th, just in a few weeks here. And what we'll be discussing in more detail is really that the AICPA updated the trust services criteria as of April 2017, and these updated criteria are referred to as TSP Section 100. So before we get to some of the changes, oftentimes a question that we get is, well, what's staying the same? So there's plenty of folks on this webinar that have been undergoing SOC audits for a number of years and want to know kind of what carries over, if you will. So we wanted to address some of those points on this slide. First and foremost, the 5 trust services domains remain intact, those being security, availability, processing integrity, confidentiality, and privacy.
Yeah, Neil, and this I wanted to just add one additional comment related to that. As our SOC 2 clients know that have been issuing reports over the last couple of years, the bulk of the requirements related to all of the criteria in the trust service criteria that you have to comply with in a SOC 2 engagement, the bulk of those are focused on security, and technically those are referred to as the common criteria. And then as you add additional trust service domains or categories such as availability, processing integrity, so on and so forth, you're adding on incremental layers of requirements that you have to have controls in place to meet. So you're not doing that same heavy lift that we had to deal with 4 or 5 years ago, if some of you guys recall how there could be so much redundancy the way the trust services principles were structured back in the day when we first started doing these engagements.
Great point. Along those lines, when you talk about the report with the 4 kind of required sections and 5th optional, those remain intact as well. So kind of the content remains very consistent with these new changes. So you still have kind of, independent auditor's opinion as one section. You have management's assertion as another. You have management's description of the system as a 3rd section, and then the independent auditor's description of their test that really helps support their opinion as the 4th section. And then you still have that optional 5th section, if you'd like, that's an unaudited section. So the report kind of layout and format remains consistent.
Yeah, Neil, and one thing I would add to that is the idea that the intended users of a SOC 2 report it's a broad class of users. So the report is not intended for a specific user entity. I mean, although you could issue a report like that, but the point being that idea that the information in the system description is going to apply to a broad class of users and readers of the report still remains in effect as we move forward. And the point being that for certain system users, certain readers of the report, the SOC 2 report is not designed to encompass all the specific aspects of the system that a particular user of the report might think to be important. So that remains consistent as we move forward.
Very good point. So speaking of reports, thought it important to note that still Type 1 and Type 2 reports apply here. Again, Type 1 being a point in time versus a Type 2 report covering an audit period. Typically, we see clients going down the path of a SOC 2 for the first time will usually issue a an initial SOC 2 report, typically for about 6 months. That can change for a couple different reasons, but typically it's about 6 months. And then after that, usually the thought is to move to a 9 or 12-month report. Again, there's some variances there, but that's typically what we see on the market. Last point we just wanted to make, readiness assessments. Again, anytime we have a client or a prospect thinking about undergoing a SOC 2 audit, we always strongly encourage them going down the path of a readiness assessment. Sometimes the term gap analysis is used. They're synonymous with one another, but essentially undergoing a readiness assessment to prepare for the subsequent attestation engagements. So John, now that I've provided some background about how we got to this point and what remains the same, let's talk a little bit about what we came here for today is what's changing.
Yeah, great, Neil. So one of the things that our clients will be able to readily identify when you look at the trust service criteria, you're going to see that the criteria incorporates COSO 2013. The 17 principles included in COSO 2013 are incorporated into the revised trust service criteria. AICPA wanted to make this change to facilitate the SOC 2 engagement or SOC 2 report being more properly aligned with overall entity control structures. And so therefore, COSO is brought into the criteria. Now, of course, COSO is not specifically an IT security framework. So in addition to the 17 principles that are included in COSO and then included in the trust service criteria going forward, there are additional cybersecurity focused criteria that have been layered on to the COSO principles. That would include some cyber elements such as logical access, change control, IT operations. And there's a significant emphasis in the new criteria on monitoring processes and uses of information within the IT environment, which is what you would expect to find in an information security type of assessment. So one thing I want to mention about the description criteria, the description criteria defines the informational requirements that need to be included in the system description going forward. AICPA has defined those in a separate publication. It's DC Section 200. You should be able to find it at the AICPA's website. I mean, of course, for our clients, that's one of the things that we provide to you as you're migrating to these new requirements. It's a little bit different than in the past, where in the past the actual requirements, that the information requirements that needed to be in the system description were defined in the 2015 SOC 2 guide. So in our opinions, you would see a reference to paragraph 1.26, and if privacy was included, 1.27 of a SOC 2 guide. But now, in our opinion, you're going to see a reference to this separate publication, DC Section 200. So one thing I wanted to mention about the trust service criteria, consistent with COSO itself, there are points of focus associated with each criteria. The points of focus are not part of the criteria technically, so that when you issue a SOC 2 report, you don't have to have controls documented and then tested for each point of focus to be able to have controls in place to achieve the criteria. But nevertheless, the points of focus are extremely important in helping both management and the service auditor evaluate the design of controls. So again, points of focus, since they're not technically part of each criteria, they would not be stated in Section 4 of the report. You would not be required to have specific controls documented or cited to meet each point of focus. But for example, as we go through a readiness process, like if we have a client that is moving into a SOC 2, has never done one before, as we apply the trust service criteria going forward, we're going to use the points of focus to help us and help the client evaluate the control structure and the appropriateness of the design. So they're still important. So related to the disclosure criteria, there are actually a couple of significant, I think they're relatively significant changes in the informational content that needs to be in the system description, which in the SOC 2 report is typically Section 3, which have not been required specifically. So the first of those items are the service commitments and system requirements. So obviously, judgment needs to be brought to bear from a management viewpoint as far as what goes into that. But the AICPA's idea and the contextual information that they provide you in trying to implement the new disclosure criteria requirements, we believe suggests that management wants to provide information that is typical of the service commitments and system requirements that they provide through most of their SLAs, MSA, contractual relationships. So what that would mean is that you may have, if you're an issuer of the report, you may have a particular user entity that has some specific technology requirements, for example. In your SOC 2 report, which is again intended, as we said earlier, intended for a broad range of users, those specific technology commitments that you're making for that one particular client, you would not be required to disclose that in the report. Now, if you had to issue a SOC 2 for that particular entity, you might end up going down a road where you're issuing a SOC report just for that entity, and in that case, that'd be a special use report. One other element in the revised disclosure criteria, which of course defines what needs to be included in the system description, is information related to security incidents that happen during the reporting period, let's say in the example of a Type 2 engagement. I think that in this case, obviously management is going to need to exercise considerable judgment. And I think that this is going to be one of those situations where management is going to want to refer to the contextual information that AICPA has provided in their ability of trying to interpret what do they need to disclose to meet this particular requirement. So let me give you just a couple of examples this is actually from AICPA's disclosure criteria document. So for example, if the incident results from one or more controls that were not suitably designed or operating effectively, then it might rise to the level that it needed to be disclosed. If the incident resulted from a significant failure in the achievement of one or more of the service organization's service commitments or system requirements. So in other words, if you have an incident in that, or a collection of incidents, and that in and of itself cause you to be in violation of a service commitment, that conceivably could rise to the level of requiring disclosure. A couple other things that they mentioned, they've actually got a few examples here, whether public disclosure of the incident was required. For example, if there was a violation of cybersecurity laws or regulations and therefore public disclosure was required, that would be a pretty good indication that it would need to be disclosed in the system description. Whether the incident had a material effect on the organization's financial position, and if there were any type of legal ramifications or regulatory responses in result to the incident. So again, this is going to be an interesting area as far as how this is implemented. I mean, we feel like, but again, we think that judgment is going to be involved, which is consistent with AICPA's comments on this. And we also feel like we're going to look to, in trying to implement this, look to AICPA's guidance and over time understand how just in general, how the profession is interpreting this and implementing it going forward.
So, John, obviously a lot of technical detail there that, again, if folks have questions, they can certainly reach out for more clarification if needed. One question did come across while you were going through some of that stuff regarding the carve-out method. Obviously, very commonly used method with a lot of SOC audits, specifically for many of our clients on this call today. One of the questions was any changes to the carve-out method or use of subservice organizations?
Yep, good question. There are not any changes in the disclosure criteria requirements going forward. so the way that's been implemented and the way that's been disclosed in previous reports, I mean, generally speaking, it's going to be consistent going forward. So, I mean, obviously, there's certain information that needs to be included in the system description when the issuer of the report uses the carve-out method, such as disclosing the services that are being carved out, the types of controls that management expects to be in place at those sub-service organizations. So all of that remains consistent. And then the use of the inclusive method, where you would actually include certain information from a sub-service organization within the context of a report, nothing has changed about that. So you can still use carve-out, you can still use inclusive, nothing significant as far as the way we've interpreted the new requirements and how one of our clients might implement either of those methods.
Great. So moving on, one of the questions that we get obviously is, and we're going to address the cost here, I know, in a second, but the other thing is there's cost in terms of dollars out, but there's also cost in terms of burden on internal resources. So we always get, what does this mean for our folks? Does this mean an increased workload? So we want to address that, and we've got a couple points on this slide here. Obviously, management's description, as John mentioned, management's description of the system will need to be updated. Controls from your prior SOC reports, if you have had kind of legacy SOC reports, will need to be mapped to the updated TSP 100. And oftentimes, not often, I will say, but depending on the number of trust service principles that you're being audited against, there is the possibility that additional controls may need to be cited to achieve this criteria. Now, I will say for current Trey Becker clients, that we are assisting with mapping and also obviously giving input on additional information that needs to be included in Section 3, which is obviously management's description of the system. We found for the majority, this typically does not result in having to implement new controls. However, we have had several where it has based on specific instances. So we didn't want to just come outright and say, oh, there's no additional controls or additional control testing that needs to be designed and performed with these new SOC audits. But typically when we found in terms of assisting with mapping as well as helping with the system description, that it typically does not result in having to implement new controls.
Neil, we've got a question regarding as a current client migrates into the new requirements that we've been discussing, do they typically need to have a formally defined readiness assessment?
Yeah, that's a great question. Typically, I will say, and I hate to use kind of the lawyer's response of it depends, but typically the answer is going to be no. Now, I will caveat that with that assumes that the scope of the kind of trust service principles remains the same. Now, if a client that had previously undergone a SOC 2 audit, for a year or a number of years, decided to increase the scope by adding on, say, the privacy principle and maybe confidentiality, for example, I'm not saying that a readiness assessment, is required. However, it is something that we would talk about with our clients to see, how comfortable they are moving forward and really make the determination with them whether or not we think a readiness assessment is appropriate in that case. But again, typically, assuming that the scope is going to remain the same from a previous SOC audit to the new standard, then no, a readiness assessment is not going to be required. All right, John, so we talked about a little bit in terms of internal increased workload. How does that translate to dollars and cents?
Yeah, great question, Neil. I mean, as you know, we've got a number of SOC 2 clients that have been issuing reports for a number of years. What we have found generally is, to your points that you made previously, it's not a tremendous heavy lift to get from the previous SOC 2 requirements related to the disclosure criteria, and then also having controls in place to meet the previous trust service principles, being able to migrate into the new system description requirements, and then also the additional control considerations and the formatting and the mapping to get into the new organization that has the COSO component to it. So we've not typically needed to pass along additional costs to most of our clients. Now, that could change if, we're assuming that there are not significant changes in the scope of the report. In other words, they were reporting on security, and now they want to add four additional categories along with security. So that would obviously be a different situation, and that the systems that are included in the scope of the report haven't changed significantly. But generally speaking, we have a number of clients who have been through the process of migrating over the last 12 months. I mean, we've been working with a lot of clients as they migrate into the new requirements, and generally they're not seeing additional costs with the services that we're providing.
That's great. I realize we're completely bumping up against time here and are seeing some questions come in that we will certainly respond back to. Kind of really in summation, there have been changes, and as we talked about at the beginning, there's been changes over really the lifespan of SOC audits. There are some additional SOC audits forthcoming that we'll talk to you about in future webinars. But really, of the changes, there are certainly some detailed things, certainly some things that need to be done on the service provider side as well as the independent auditor side. Obviously, we're here to help. One of the questions is, so what now, or when do we need to get started? Like with any changes, the earlier the better. The more communication we have with our clients, the happy we are, and typically they are. So we obviously wanted to put this webinar out to provide information, but also to get folks thinking about it. We have many 630 and 930 SOC 2 clients that aren't really going to be thinking about this for upwards of 6 to 9 months, whereas we want to get out in front of it a little bit more and talking with our clients. So we certainly will be doing that, but don't hesitate to reach out to us as well. We've got our contact information up here. Again, I know we ran out of time and apologize for that, but hopefully you found the information today useful, and you have our contact information here on the screen. By all means, drop us a line. Let us know if you have any questions. For those that did submit questions that we didn't get to, we certainly will follow up with you as well. With that said, for John and I, we want to thank you again for attending Cherry Bekaert's webinar entitled SOC 2 Changes and What This Means to You. Be on the lookout for future webinars regarding SOC audits. These could be SOC for cyber as well as SOC for vendor supply chain. And again, we thank you for attending and wish everyone a happy holidays. Thanks so much.